also to the Malays, see power as something concrete. That means power is manifested in brutality sometimes, in assertion, in rules, in regulation. Homogeneous, that means power comes in one form that exerts itself onto society, and constant in total quantity, and without inherent moral implications as such. What he's saying here is that the Javanese conception of power is very, very nuanced. It's very, very diffuse. That power is not only top-down. Power also exists at an everyday life. Power is exerted by people of different levels of society. And they may not have moral implications. That means when power is asserted into society, it may not change society towards a moral direction. It can change the society from a material sense, and so forth and so forth. The big point that Benedict Anderson is trying to make here is that the Javanese conception of power, kuasa, is very, very sophisticated. And the same is it with Malays. If you observe Malays very, very carefully, and I've lived with them, I'm among them as well, and I consider myself as one of them, the ways in which Malays push power into society, into families, into the people around them is always very subtle, but very, very effective. And this is what Benedict Anderson is trying to emphasize here. The work by Sherry Arrington, The Subject of Power in Southeast Asia, in an edited book on Southeast Asian perspectives on power, she says that new worlds and new formations of knowledge, power and polity are now emerging, and with them new topics and new subject matter, as well as new subjectivities and new ways of constituting and authorizing power. What she's basically trying to say here is that we now need to change our conceptions of power from what has been understood by the West to look at how Southeast Asians understand it in a totally different way. Now, Benedict Anderson has basically thrown the first stone to say that the Javanese has an interesting idea of power. Now, what would be the idea of power amongst the Malays, amongst the Bugis, amongst the Javanese, and so forth and so forth? Sherry Arrington says that rather than investigating the nature and characteristics of entities within stable categories, people are studying the emergence of categories and narratives which are at once material and fraught with meaning, and which are constructed within layers of differing powers and institutions. Now, to put it very simply, we need not understand power as it has been practiced in Malay societies in a manner to which the West understood it. Rather, our duty as people from Southeast Asia, while we derive from a lot of the historiographies that have been written so far from the West and from somewhere else, is to understand power among Southeast Asians in their own terms. And this is where we need to understand women's power in Southeast Asia from the perspectives of women themselves. So even if I'm a man studying women in Southeast Asia, I am trying to sell this idea to everyone who's listening in, that we need to understand power from the eyes of women themselves. And to understand power from the eyes of women themselves require us to dig deeper into the sources that we have in Southeast Asia, to read them in a very, very analytical way, and to try and theorize with new concepts and new narratives, women's power in Southeast Asia. So let's now get and dive into the forms of women power in Southeast Asia. And as I'm discussing the forms of women power in Southeast Asia, I will ask some questions, because these questions will be areas of future research that all of the students and the staff who are listening in can actually develop. And indeed, I feel that a lot of the questions that I'm going to ask here are things that you can use for your PhD projects, your masters, and your term papers, and so forth and so forth. So one book that I would recommend for you to read is this one by Barbara Watson Andaya. She and her husband wrote the famous The History of Malaysia. But one of the iconic books that she has written throughout her very long career as a historian is this book entitled The Flaming Wound, Repositioning Women in Early Modern Southeast Asia. Even though she discussed early modern Southeast Asia, a lot of her conclusions are so important in us trying to understand how women actually manifest and express power in Southeast Asian societies. Now, the first form of power, go back to my point earlier on bodies, that women in Southeast Asia have is the power of procreation. And we know, especially historically, women were very powerful because fertility was regarded as an asset. The fact that a woman can give birth gives her a lot of power, be it in courts or in families on the ground, because the Rajas want children that can continue the name of the throne or the name of the family. And this is where women can be powerful when they do not allow the Rajas or the people on the ground to have children. So the whole idea of procreating, of giving birth, is a form of power in itself. And that's why if you speak to your grandmother, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-grandmother, in the past, Malays especially, and of course non-Malays who lived in the Malay world, they would have a lot of children. Why do they have a lot of children? Because children provided manpower for the family. That's one. But children are also seen as a form of wealth. Children were regarded as an embodiment of the fertility of the mother, but more importantly, how the mother is so powerful in the fact that she could actually give birth to as many children as possible. So during the pre-modern period, women who bore a lot of children were held in high esteem. That's why when you talk to the old guards, they are so proud when they say that they have 12 children, 16 children, 24 children, and so forth and so forth. And a fertile body is always highly regarded than a well-shaped body. So today, Hollywood and all of the social media would like us to believe that a well-shaped body is what we should be going after. People are showing how they go to the gyms and so forth and so forth. In the past, the well-shaped body is not what people seek for. People are seeking for women with bodies that can procreate. And that's why, if you ever heard this before, maybe many of you are listening in are a bit too young, perempuan yang punggungnya besar. They say that women with big, how do you say it in English? With their backs that are big are more preferred in the past than those who are small and petite and so forth and so forth. Now, the question that we need to ask when it comes to the power to procreate is, why have ideas regarding women's procreative powers changed, right? Why did it change? Why is it that in the past, having a lot of children, when a woman have a lot of children, she is regarded as not only fertile, but very powerful. But now, many people loathe having children. Why is it that women themselves now do not see this as a form of power in itself? What happened to society? Why did we change our idea of power? Because the less children that you have, the less you have manpower in your family. And of course, that affects everybody else. So that's one question that we need to try and unravel, right? Why did this power of procreation actually change? The other form of power that you can see in the Malay community or Malay world in the past is what we can call as domestic power. Now, women, even though they stayed at home, historically, and sometimes even until now, were masters and guardians of the homes. And domestic power means that they have control of not only the home, but things that are happening in it. Knowledge of the home allowed women to assert their authority whenever they deemed necessary, and they became cultural brokers and gatekeepers of norms and values. So when women stays at home, they're not only there to manage the home and to keep the homes clean, but they were also people who ensure that the cultures of the home is maintained. That's why when you go to kampong communities and you see marriages happening and people want to get married, the first people that they need to consult are not actually the men, but actually the women, because the women are the ones who are the gatekeepers of cultures in a given family. So the other form of power that we do not see is actually domestic powers. Try to ask your dad who actually decides on the major issues in your home. Your dad will readily say it's actually your mother who will who give the final stand. But when the mother meets everybody else, she's just quiet. So this is the powerful thing about women. Their powers are subtle, but they are often very effective. Now, what's interesting now, the question that we need to ask when it comes to domestic power is, with the increasing number of women working outside the home, do women actually still wield power in domestic sphere as they did in the past? So now women are not staying home. They are not so very in tune with what's happening at home. If in the past the mother is at home, the mother knows what's happening to the children, The mother knows who comes in and who comes out. Now the mother comes out in the morning and comes back in the late afternoon. Nothing is at home. Sometimes only the domestic worker is at home. What is happening right now? Do they still have domestic power like they used before? Do women now still maintain the same role as cultural brokers and gatekeepers as they had in the past, right? The third form of power is the power of specialized labor. So just now we talked about the domestic power. When women stay at home, they also do certain tasks. So historically, women worked in the fields. They gathered while men hunted, right? And that means that they also know the environment around them. If you look at the histories of the Malay world, women were actually expert traders. And this is still there when you travel to places like Terengganu and Kelantan. If you go to the markets of Terengganu and Kelantan, most of the women are actually in the markets. Where are the men? Don't ask me. They are somewhere out there, mostly in the coffee shops. Now, women for many hundred years were controlling businesses in this part of the world. And because they were controlling businesses in many states such as Aceh, Patani, and others, they not only functioned as ambassadors, they also became queens. In many places within Indonesia, from the 16th all the way until the 19th century, there were many women queens that basically managed a lot of these sultanates that were there. They married foreign merchants and dignitaries, and they bore many children, the power of procreation, accumulated a lot of wealth, and then went their separate ways. So nowadays, when people look at the Malay community, for example, we always say that, oh, Malays are always having divorce. Divorce in the Malay world is normal in the past. A woman would be divorced at least 3 to 4 times within her lifetime. But as they got divorced, they actually accumulated wealth in Southeast Asia. That was possible in the past because there was an arrangement where when women get divorced from the men, even though they may be foreigners, have to leave their children as well as their wealth behind. So women actually benefited from divorce because they were highly specialized, because they were working not only in the homes, but they were also managing businesses. And that is a form of power in itself. And with the coming of modernity, that power then fizzled out. What global capitalism has done is to make men and women share the same specialized labor. And that's why when we go to work now, the majority of people at work nowadays are actually women. There's no specialization anymore. The man goes out to get money for the family. The women goes out to get the money for the family. Nobody has domestic power because domestic power now becomes shared. But more importantly, even outside, both of them have the same specialization. The power of women then become very diluted because of this arrangement. Now, the question that we need to ask is, how has global capitalism transformed the types of labor that women engage in, and what are the implications of this? Now, with the coming of global capitalism, with the bringing together of men and women into the same market, competing for the same jobs, the women who used to have specialized labor now do not have it anymore. So power now becomes even more diluted because of global capitalism and modernity. So if you want to read more about the idea of the division of labor in society, you can read the book, the classic book by Emile Durkheim, where he talks about how the traditional societies used to have men and women working in different places and different occupations. And because of that, they have more control over their own respective specializations and the people around them. And last but not least is the power of marriage and remarriage. And I mentioned this earlier on. Women could divorce anytime they want to. And divorced women were actually in high demand in the past. Divorce was not a taboo in the past. As mentioned by Anthony Reid, the pan-Southeast Asian pattern of women autonomy meant that divorce did not markedly reduce a woman's livelihood status or network of kin support. Now, the question that we need to ask then is, why has divorce become a social stigma now, and to what effect? If in the past, divorce actually enriched many of these women, what is happening now to our society? With the rise of nuclear families, divorce have actually caused a lot of poverty, especially in a country like Singapore, the power of marriage and remarriage is now again taken away from women. So I just want to end. The last point that I want to bring up with regards to the power of women is the what we call as myth power. I was like contemplating whether I should actually present this one, but maybe we should talk about it. That in the Malay society and in other societies in the Malay world, mythology and folklore is a big thing. There have been myths about women all over Southeast Asia, linked to this whole idea of women having myth power is sorcery, or what we call as sihir or witchcraft. When we talk about witchcraft, we always talk about women first, nenek kebayan. And we always say, don't mess with a pregnant woman, because if you mess with a pregnant woman, what happens? She becomes a Puntiana. And then you know that there are a lot of movies about Puntiana. Now, that's one interesting thing that people don't realize, that when we look at all of the ghost stories in Southeast Asia, the most powerful hantu in Southeast Asia has always been the women hantu. Why? Because it shows how women are so powerful in Southeast Asia. And go back to my issue about the power of procreation, right? The lady died because she wanted to give birth. She was not taken care of. She becomes a ghost, and she starts hunting for men all over the place, right? So all of these things tell us that myth is very, very important. Myth attached to women define women's power in societies. Now, many of these myths actually fulfill many functions. They ensure the physical protection of women in society. Stories of hantu actually help to protect women in the past, because if you see a woman walking home, you don't want to disturb the woman. She might just be Puntiana. So these myths actually had a very powerful function. They enforce customary laws that are in place. The customary laws in the past is that women who are pregnant ought to be taken care of like queens, so that the child will be healthy. And if you don't take care of her and she dies and she becomes Puntiana, she will haunt the house. The myths also help to maintain harmonious relations in the household. So take care of your wife, or else she dies and then she will haunt you for the rest of the life. So all of these stories of hantu, whether it's true or not, is not something I'm interested in, but they are actually used as a form of power. It could be that women actually told these stories. I've not heard any newspaper reports telling that someone died because he was hunted by Puntiana. But the stories of Puntiana are so powerful that people are afraid of Puntiana more than anything else in their lives. And that actually shows how powerful myths are in the Malay community, especially myths about women. So now we need to ask the question, if when we look at domestic power, specialized labor, and so forth, there's a kind of like dilution or declining power of women in those aspects. But why is it when it comes to myth power, women are still very powerful? So how do we explain the endurance of these myths till the present day? We have become so modernized, we become so Islamized to some people. People have become more rationalized. People have become more, even if you're not a Muslim, even if you're a Christian or any other religion, people are now becoming more and more rational, but people still believe in many of these myths. Why is it still there? When other things are declining, myths are not declining. Of course, we can blame the movie directors for making all of these Pontianak stories and ghost stories, but within societies itself, why are people still believing in this, and why is it still powerful until today, are the things that we need to talk about when we talk about the power of women. So I just would like to conclude by saying that the historiography of women is going to expand very widely than ever before now. And the reason has to do with the fact that a lot of women are actually contributing to this expanding literature. And one aspect of this expanding literature is the power of women. And as I've mentioned, we need to have a more nuanced, a more sophisticated ideas. We need to have more sophisticated ideas of how to understand the power of women in society. Power may not be necessarily political power. Yes, there are women in politics arguing for places in parties and so forth. But power also can be expressed in other areas, be it in domestic areas, be it in labor, be it in procreation, be it in myth, be it in trade, and so forth. And the reality is that women, for many hundred years, have been very powerful in Southeast Asian history. They still have power until today, but we need to open up our eyes, change our lenses, and look at their agency properly in order for us to uncover the forms of power that have always been there amongst women in Southeast Asian and in the Malay society. So I will just end here. Maybe we have a bit of discussion on the topic. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for your insight. And I can say on the behalf of the audience that the topic today is actually very interesting, that we have uncovered the role of women in history and the extended elaborations on the discourse. So Dr. Khairudin, we only have one question for today, and the question is regarding the marriage and remarriage. You mentioned about that divorce was historically not seen as a taboo, and then divorced women were still socially valued. And then it happens on the stigmatization of divorce. So the question is, what happened that led to the stigmatization of divorce, particularly for women? Is it because of the colonial rule? Is it because of religious beliefs? Or is it because of the modern capitalist forces that led into this shift? So that would be the question that we have for today.
Okay, very good. So the stigmatization, I think, began when the British, the Dutch, the Spanish, and other colonial powers came into this part of the world. And they brought with them Christian ideas of marriage and divorce. Now, in Christianity, you are supposed to be married till death do us part. And divorce has always been shunned upon, except for some Protestant groups that actually accept the arrangement. And those ideas were implemented by way of laws in Southeast Asian societies. Although they respected Islamic laws, what the colonial powers did was to put out ideas that marriage has to stay within a given arrangement till the person actually dies. And this was new to Southeast Asian people, because even before the coming of Islam, divorce was actually very high. So what the Muslims actually had inherited is actually a pre-Islamic idea of marriage and divorce, that marriages are not necessarily permanent and that being divorced is not something that is bad. Now, the colonial powers had already changed that through their ideology. But the thing that made it even more powerful or even more influential, the whole idea that divorce is a stigma, was the post-colonial state. Now, when Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and other countries were established, many of the states implemented the very laws and ideologies that the colonial powers left behind. People start taking statistics, and the statistics have it that Malays, they have this number of divorce. Chinese have certain numbers of divorce, and Indians have certain numbers of divorce. Divorce was not only quantified, but also racialized. And it becomes tied to social problems. The problem became even more chronic, not only because of quantification, but also because of the housing arrangements that were changed. If in the past, women who get divorced would just go back, in Sumatra, they say, pulang ke rumah mamaknya. That means you go back to your uncle's house. Your uncle, your father, your brother had the duty to take care of you until you get married again, you go back to your new husband. So they lived in a communal way where a divorced woman would always get help from their families. But what happened in the post-colonial period was the rise of cities and urban living, where people start staying separated from one another. And when they get a divorce, with the ideology that's already been implemented by the colonial powers and continued by the post-colonial state, the women who are left behind by the men are now seen as single parents. So this new term came about, which was never the case in the past, because there's no such thing as single parent. Even though the lady is divorced, she goes back to her uncle's or her parents' house, there are still parents around. If you don't call them parent, you call them grandparents. That's why if you look at a lot of the accounts of kampung people who the mother or the father got a divorce, the children will still call their grandfather ayah and ibu, because the idea of a parent is far more fluid than how the modern people actually defined it. So we can blame, and you're right to say that we can blame multiple successive waves of forces that have asserted themselves into Malay society, the forces of colonialism, the forces of modernity, the roles of the post-colonial state, and more importantly, I would say, also the wrongful idea of divorce, especially within the Muslim community itself, right? they developed this whole idea that divorce is bad. Yes, it is to a great extent because it leads to imbalance when it comes to raising the child. But the bad that has been defined because of the coming of certain movements from certain parts of the world led to stigmatization. In the Arab world and in India, in South Asia, divorce is seen as something really, really bad. But not in this part of the world. Not that divorce is celebrated where, bersatu kita tegur, bercerai kahwin lagi kind of talk. But what people in this part of the world understood was that divorce need not actually mean disenfranchisement. That means you are not taken out from the wealth that you have. You're not taken out from the family that you have. There is an alternative. There was and have been alternative arrangements for people who are divorced. So that idea, that way of thinking that came, because I do not want to say that it is from Islam, it's actually from culture, from the Arab world and from South Asia came into this part of the world. People adopted this, and that all of this actually led to divorce being seen as something that is utterly negative. Now, I wish to qualify here because the people listening in might get the wrong idea to say, okay, now I'm going to get a divorce. Because Khairudin said that divorce should not be seen as bad. So since it's not bad, let's just do it. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that divorce in the Malay society was accepted precisely because marriage, or the idea of marriage, the understanding of marriage is far wider than me marrying a woman. Rather, the idea of marriage included extended families, where parents come into the picture, where the village also helped to ensure that the marriages work, and if the marriages don't work, the child would be taken care of also by the villagers. If you have such an arrangement, and if the marriage just couldn't work out, and there are problems within the relationship between husband and wife, by all means, divorce might be an alternative. But it is not a magic pill for many of the issues that we may face in an everyday life. Okay. Yeah.
All right. What a brilliant answer, Dr. Khairudin, on the question of marriage and remarriage. And I think that will be all the questions that we have for today. So, ladies and gentlemen, and Dr. Khairudin, we have come to the end of our RnR session for today. We would like to thank Dr. Khairudin. It is a privilege to have a distinguished scholar whose work continues to inspire and challenge us all, especially in this topic of women and feminism, and its again extended roles. So for our viewers, we would like to say thank you so much for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe and follow our social media. And we wish you thank you very much and have a pleasant day. So thank you very much, Dr. Khairudin, and everyone.